spent my whole career in that position, but for the fact that there were President Reagan era rifts. There were, I think that he reduced the federal workforce by like 20%, and at the time in the mid-'80s, all of the women in the office lost their jobs.
Oh, wow.
All of the women, because all of the men had veterans preference. Almost all of them were veterans. So it was odd. It was a little odd. So we got our notices that we were going to be riffed. But before the riff actually occurred, I secured another position. And once again, it was totally serendipitous. I had been a volunteer pro tem judge in Alameda County, and I would do night court for small claims court. And they were looking to hire their first commissioner to handle small claims court, traffic court, misdemeanor court. And because all the clerks knew me and really liked me, they supported my application, and I was hired before my riff in the first job. And I felt extremely lucky because once again I was in a neutral position. It wasn't that I had this goal necessarily to be a judge, but I liked being in the position of a neutral, and so this just dovetailed very nicely for me.
And just curious, but what is it about being a neutral, do you think, that suits you so well? Is there something, do you think, in your personality, or just by training, or basic demeanor that really calls to you about being a neutral and that suits you for it?
I think it's a combination of the role I've always played in my family and just my personality. I think it's a combination of both. I'm the youngest of 3 kids. I have 2 older brothers, but I was always sort of the bossy one, and I was always the one that was more analytical and making the decisions for us as a group when the 3 of us needed to get together. And I think I just sort of gravitated naturally to being a sort of a decision maker as opposed to an advocate. I think I'm better at it. Of course, the only advocacy job that I held in my career was as a public defender, but I do think I'm a better judge than I was an advocate.
And were there any early challenges as a young lawyer, because you were pretty young taking on some of these neutral roles, were there any particular challenges that you recall sort of coming up against and maybe needing to overcome?
Not that I can really think of. The Alameda Court was mainly a challenge to my ability to manage people. It was more of a public relations kind of job as far as I could see. The commissioners, well, we all know that state court is where all of the world's problems end up, right? Because there aren't solutions, and so people are, they find themselves in the civil or criminal justice system. And the commissioners are sort of the first face that people see, and you represent the cop that gave you the ticket, the fines that you're going to have to pay, and all that. So it became, I think, a real challenge to my ability to deal with 300 people in the course of a morning. I mean, my calendars would be hundreds of people. So while I do think I learned more people skills and learning a degree of patience, learning how to manage cases and people and move things quickly while still giving the appearance of justice and fairness, I think I learned that there, although it wasn't an intellectually challenging job, which sort of turned me away from it.
And as you went through these different roles and sort of career choices that eventually, and we're going to get to that in a second, brought you to being a judge, were there any particular mentors or specific influences and people that helped steer you through your early career?
Yeah, I've actually been very fortunate to have had really strong women role models in almost every position that I've had, and particularly in the Oakland court, I had, there were 2 judges, one who I'm still very close to, Judy Ford. She was the chief judge of that court during a period of time that I was the commissioner. She was a really good role model, and in fact, I had met her for the first time when I was in law school, when she came to speak at the invitation of the Feminist Law Students Association. Can you believe in the 70s there was something called the Feminist Law Students Association? And she was the director of the regional director of the Federal Trade Commission at the time. I was so impressed by her, and I couldn't believe my good fortune when 10 years later I find myself in a position where she's interviewing me for a job, and she hired me, she recommended me, she supported me, and she was a mentor to me and a real supporter of women for all the years that I was in Alameda County.
And how important did you feel that mentorship, particularly within your own career, was to influence you as you were, deciding, for example, what's the next right step for me?
Well, what I really learned from her, I think, is the value of mentorship to people. She helped me. I feel like I was successful. I felt she had a stake in my success. That's how much she cared about whether or not I was able to do the job, whether or not I had the support and resources I needed to do it. And that became important to me as I advanced in my career and was in a position to provide that kind of support and care to younger people coming behind me. It's all about the people on whose shoulders we stand and our responsibility to pull up ones coming behind us. And it's particularly important to me for attorneys and women of color who don't have the same kind of opportunities. I really do think that that's what success is built on. It's opportunity. There's so many people who, but for some particular opportunity they're given, wouldn't have wouldn't be able to do much with their lives. But because the doors were opened for me, I have to prove myself once I get there, right? But having someone to help open the doors for you is all a lot of people. That's all they need. It's just help me get my foot in the front door. Judy Ford was that for me in my early years, and I've tried to be that for other people coming behind me.
Yeah. Well, as a recipient, I can definitely attest to that. I'd love to talk a little bit about how you actually transitioned to your judgeship, essentially, and how did that opportunity arise for you, your opportunity to join the Northern District?
Once again, totally serendipitous. A lawyer was talking to me during the period of time that I was at Oakland Union Court. I contacted Claudia Wilkin, who was a magistrate judge at the time. And she gave me a lot of the background information, and I decided that it sounded really interesting and I would apply. Because of the work that I had done, and I had a good reputation in Alameda County, even though none of the judges of the district court who make the decision to hire magistrate judges, none of them knew me, but I interviewed well. They checked my references. I had great support in Alameda County, and they decided to take a chance on me, and they hired me as a magistrate judge. And I thought, wow, that's pretty amazing. Because I had not been a federal practitioner. I worked for a federal agency, but that was it. But I did have some judicial skills. So that's what prompted me to make the move from state court into federal court, and that's where I've been since.
Wow. And what was your first experience like in federal court and in federal practice? Was that a tough transition to make from, more state side?
I have to say it's very, very different experience.
Yeah.
There's far more decorum and order and process, all the things I love. All the things I love. It brought out the best of me. I think being a federal magistrate judge, particularly in the Northern District of California, was really one of the best jobs that I ever had.
Wow. And you were at that job for several years before you made the move to Article 3 and were appointed by President Clinton. Because that does not necessarily happen to every magistrate judge, how did that happen? How did that door open for you?
Well, I actually was sort of prompted to apply. Someone on one of the vetting committees called me and said, appeared before you. I've worked with you on settling cases. Have you given any thought to throwing in your hat in the ring for Article 3 judgeship? Well, no, I don't know that I have the background and credentials for that kind of thing. Well, you want to give it some consideration. So I thought about it, and I applied. And it was funny, during the interview that I had with the vetting committee, there was a lawyer on the committee who was from Chicago, and he said, how does a girl from Jacksonville, Illinois, how do you feel finding yourself here being interviewed for a position that might be a lifetime appointment by a president of the United States? And I thought, I feel blessed and honored that I've even made it this far. So I was interviewed. I was recommended as a finalist to Senator Feinstein. I was interviewed by Senator Feinstein along with a number of other very prominent lawyers. I didn't think I had a shot at it. It took almost a year before I got a call, but I got a call. I got a call from her chief of staff one day, and he said, I know it's been a long time, but I'm just calling to find out, are you still interested in this position? At the time, I had just met the man of my dreams. I was on the verge of getting married. My life was changing. I wasn't quite as interested in having a new job as I had been before, but I was really curious as to whether or not they'd even consider picking me. Why else would they call me unless they were really considering? So of course I said yes. And then she called me the next day and said she was going to recommend me to the president.
Wow.
Which was, I mean, it's just not an experience that I would ever have thought to have had in my lifetime. To be recommended by a senator.
That's amazing.
It was pretty amazing.
And did you have any hesitancy at all about, going forward with the process as you were deciding, or was it just, a natural extension of everything you've done before?
No, I did have some hesitancy. I have to say, I loved being a magistrate judge. I loved it. And the workload in our district at the time was just daunting. The district judges worked so much harder than we did. And their caseloads were so huge. Yes, I did have some hesitancy, but I'm glad that I did it. And I was able to work out from underneath the workload. And I'm the last judge on our court in which which received a caseload built on all the discards from other judges. We stopped doing that because it's so inhumane for a new judge to start with 400 or 500 cases that nobody else wanted, right? We don't do that anymore. We give new judges only new cases. But anyway, I was the last judge, and it did take me about 5 years to sort of dig my way out of that. But once I did, I realized that this is actually the best job in the world.
So that transition between magistrate judge and Article 3 judge, was it as, it's not shocking, but was it as much of a change as you had anticipated?
Yes, and more so. I don't think there's any way to describe or any way to appreciate the unrelenting flow of paper that a district judge deals with. Even to this day, even though our caseloads have shrunk a bit, it's unrelenting. And in order to adjust to that, you have to adjust your way of thinking, your approach to the work. You can't be the kind of person that I have always been that wants to check off my to-do list and be done and be able to go, okay, I'm done. You can't do that. Because as soon as you check one off, another one comes in. So you have to be satisfied with the individual accomplishments.
And what were the changes that you had to make to do that?
I'm not sure that I actually have satisfactorily made that change. I mean, I still like to, feel that sense of satisfaction. But I think I've gotten accustomed to it, and it doesn't bother me anymore. I think I've called upon the advice I was given by a departing judge when I first took the position, and he said, Phyllis, you have your whole life to do this job.
Wow. And your career is so remarkable, I think, for one, I think your background and what you experienced growing up and how it has been a formative one that has changed your outlook, I think, and your, the resilience and the grit you've shown, and also because I think many Article III judges don't have as much time in their career being a neutral as you had before you eventually became an Article III judge. And I'm just curious, are there things in your background you think that uniquely suit you, and your career as well, but that uniquely suit you to be a good judge? That, by the time you took the bench as an Article III judge, you'd been developing for many, many years, and maybe help you develop qualities that you think are particularly good on the bench. Are there?
Well, I think the qualities that are good for a judge are sort of in the eye of the beholder. I mean, I think they're different for different people. For me, it's important to show patience and understanding, to not be quick with the sanctions, to try to set the tone through your own conduct and the way you treat people. I have a much softer touch, I think, than others, although a good command of the courtroom is important. And the values that I think are most important is to make sure that people are fully heard and to resolve things as expeditiously as possible. I mean, I'm not the kind of person that sits on things for a long time. I think litigation, in order for it to be effective and to comply with Rule 1's directive, I think that decisions have to be made, and they have to be made quickly, not quickly, but expeditiously.
Right. And how about some of the more memorable cases that have come before you? Do you have, one or two that stick out as particularly career-defining for you as a judge?
Yeah, a couple. I think that in 2002, I was appointed in 2000, and in 2002, I received an assignment. I had a request to preside over my first MDL, a multi-district litigation. I'd only been a district judge for 2 years, and this involved antitrust law, about which I knew nothing, which of course you know. And it took a couple of years for the case to build up, but from about 2004 until about 2012, that really was the most significant case and the most resource-intensive case that I worked on. It was about 60 some odd class actions that were consolidated before me, and it involved every issue of antitrust law, as you know, that can potentially arise. And I have to say that what I enjoyed most about that, including our 5 years together, you as the clerk with total responsibility for that case, including the stints during which I had to hire another law clerk to handle your other work because you were working exclusively on that. But I have to say that I look back at that as being one of the biggest challenges as a district judge for me, but one of the biggest joys. It brought me intellectual satisfaction because the issues were so meaty and because it required us to go places where courts hadn't gone before.
Right.
I felt like we were contributing to the development of the law. It's simply unfortunate, though, that for every really critical order that we issued on that case, that the lawyers would always take it up on appeal and dismiss the appeal the day before the oral argument, right?
Yeah.
So there's still no answers to a lot of these questions. Here we are 12 years later. So I would say that the DRAM, antitrust MDL, was important for me. And it was important for me for another couple of reasons. Because I had no background in it. Of course, you coming to work for me from McCutcheon, where you had some background in antitrust, was a monumental help, and it was so satisfying to me. And I don't know if I've ever told you this, Claudia, but for you and I to walk out into that courtroom and to see 40, for the most part, white male antitrust lawyers. There's still not enough women and people of color practicing in that area, in my view. But to command their attention and their respect. And to handle that case the way we did was a very proud time for me. Very, very proud.
Yeah, I felt the same thing. Just from my own, when I would walk in and I would see all of that, I just remember the sea of suits that you would see in the courtroom, and I would feel very proud just watching you up on the take the bench.
Yeah.
So I definitely felt it too.
So the business cases, because I don't have a business background, were a source of pride for me, being able to handle them. My big Oracle versus SAP trial, which you recused on because your best friend was one of the lawyers.
Yeah.
But having that trial with those lawyers working at such a high level, I'd never tried a case other than a patent case in which the lawyering was so good and the attention to detail was just so incredibly high. And I enjoyed that. It was so much work, but I really enjoyed it, and I particularly enjoyed being affirmed, even after having busted the verdict. I mean, the $1.3 billion verdict, which I overturned, I think it's the only time in my entire career that I ever overturned a verdict, but it was clearly the right thing to do, and I can say that even though the Ninth Circuit affirmed me. So the business cases, I think, provided me some of my proudest moments, just because I had no background in it. But I also had one criminal trial that was particularly memorable for me, involving a Vietnamese national who was living in France at the time, but she came to the United States to protest the communist government, and her intent was to self-immolate.